thinking about building a family maybe,
Yeah.
or, just wanting to see kids in your community really thrive. The reality is, finding stable, loving homes for children in foster care, well, it's a challenge, a big one, with really profound implications. And I think for many of you listening, maybe in that 22 to 45 range, as you're figuring out your futures, maybe expanding your own families, this issue probably feels pretty close to home.
It absolutely does. I mean, the well-being of these kids and the strength of the families who step up to care for them, it's just fundamental. And policymakers, recognizing how complex this all is, have definitely been looking at ways to make the system better.
Which brings us right to what we're diving into today, the Recruiting Families Using Data Act of 2025. It's a new bill just passed, and it's aimed squarely at tackling a core problem. How do we get more foster and adoptive families into the system? And just as importantly, how do we make sure they get the support they need to actually stay?
Exactly. And that title, Using Data, that's a big clue right there about the approach. This isn't just about, hoping for the best. It's really about using data-driven strategies to fundamentally improve how we connect children who need homes with stable, loving families.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear then. Let's unpack what this act actually does. What are the key pieces, and what could it mean for foster care, and maybe for listeners who are even considering becoming foster or adoptive parents themselves?
Precisely. And we should stress, this isn't just dry legal text. It outlines some really concrete plans and, importantly, ways to measure whether things are actually improving. We're looking right at the bill text itself.
Great. So let's start at the top. What's the absolute core goal of this new law?
Well, like the name says, the main aim is a big improvement in recruiting foster and adoptive parents and, crucially, keeping them involved retention. The Act actually amends a really key piece of existing law, the Social Security Act, to put a much stronger focus right on achieving this.
Okay, the Social Security Act, that's huge, obviously. Where specifically does this new act slot in? How does it make its mark?
So it zeroes in on Section 422 of the Social Security Act. You can think of Section 422 as like the rule book for state child welfare services. It outlines how states manage things and get federal funding. This new act strategically inserts requirements right into that core section. Essentially, it mandates that states must now develop something called a family partnership plan. This becomes a central part of their strategy to make sure they have enough foster and adoptive homes. It's not just a nice idea, it's laid out as a requirement in a new subsection, subsection D.
A family partnership plan.
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds like it needs to be pretty thorough. What are the key ingredients, must-haves for this plan?
It's definitely designed to be a detailed roadmap and, importantly, a collaborative one. The Act really emphasizes that these plans have to be developed with input from a whole range of people who are actually involved or have direct experience. We're talking birth parents, kinship caregivers, current foster and adoptive families, the people right there doing the work, plus community service providers, technical experts, and, this is really key, young people who have actually been in foster care.
Wow, okay, so it's not just the state agency making the plan in a vacuum.
Exactly. That's a big shift, really. Moving away from maybe more top-down approaches, including folks with lived experience like former foster youth or birth parents, brings in perspectives that honestly have often been missing.
Yeah, that makes complete sense, getting all those viewpoints. So what specific things do these plans need to cover? What areas must they address?
The Act spells out several critical areas. One big one is relative engagement. The plans have to lay out exactly how the state is going to actively find, notify, engage, and then importantly, support relatives or other people the child already knows as potential placement options.
Right, keeping kids connected to family whenever possible. That's huge for their sense of identity, their stability.
Absolutely. It really underscores that priority.
What else needs to be in these plans?
Another really significant piece is the requirement for child-specific recruitment plans. This means for every child who needs a foster or adoptive family, the state has to create an individualized plan to find the right match.
Individualized, so not just a general call for foster parents.
Right. It sounds basic, maybe, but it's a shift. Instead of just waiting for families to come forward, states now need proactive strategies. They need to actively look for families who are the best fit for that specific child's unique needs, maybe medical needs, behavioral challenges, or keeping siblings together. It moves away from a one-size-fits-all approach.
Okay, a much more tailored search for the right home for each kid. And what about the kids themselves? You mentioned youth involvement earlier. How does the Act make sure their voices are actually heard in this process?
Yeah. The Act specifically says the plans must describe how the state will authentically engage children and youth in the efforts to find them a permanent family. It's about empowering them in a process that affects their entire lives, making sure their feelings, their preferences are genuinely considered.
That's fantastic and often overlooked, I think. Now, the Act's title mentions data. Let's talk about that. How does data fit into these family partnership plans?
This is absolutely central and probably resonates with listeners thinking about, effective solutions. The Act mandates using data in several really key ways. States need it to set clear, measurable goals. They need it to properly assess the needs within their system, like where are the gaps? And then crucially, they have to use data to track their progress toward those goals.
Progress on what specifically?
Things like reducing unnecessary placements in congregate care group homes and such, increasing permanency, getting kids back home, adopted or into guardianships, improving placement stability so kids aren't bouncing around, and boosting kinship placements with relatives.
So really using the numbers to drive improvement and hold themselves accountable, what kind of specific data points do they need to track for that?
It gets pretty detailed. States have to track how well they're doing recruiting and retaining families for specific groups who often have a harder time finding homes. Think teenagers, sibling groups that need to stay together, kids with specialized medical or developmental needs. They also need to analyze whether the demographics of their available foster and adoptive families actually line up with the diverse backgrounds and needs of the children in care.
Aligning demographics. That sounds important, but maybe tricky. What's the thinking there?
Well, it's about ensuring, cultural competency, understanding, making sure kids are placed where their cultural, racial, linguistic backgrounds are respected and supported as much as possible. It's a complex piece, for sure.
It sounds like they're really trying to get a comprehensive picture where the system's working, where it's falling short. What about the foster families? Is there a formal way for them to feed back into this?
Yes, definitely. The Act requires states to either set up or actively support foster family advisory boards. The specific job of these boards is to provide direct feedback and insights from foster and adoptive families. That input is then meant to be used to improve recruitment and retention.
So harnessing the experience of people on the front lines.
Exactly. It recognizes their perspective is invaluable. Though, the real test will be how much influence these boards actually have in practice. The Act requires them, but states need to genuinely listen and act on the feedback.
That's always the question with advisory boards, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so feedback loops are being built in. Beyond the initial plan, what about ongoing data collection? What reporting is required year after year?
There's an annual reporting requirement on several key metrics. States have to report their actual foster family capacity, like how many homes do they really have available. They also have to report on how much they're using congregate care, including details about the kids in those settings, whether they're placed in state or out of state. And critically, they need to provide detailed info about their licensed foster families and prospective adoptive families.
What kind of details?
The total number, their demographics, their characteristics, but also how many aren't currently receiving placements or seem underutilized, and crucially, why that might be happening.
Oh, okay. So trying to figure out if there are licensed homes just sitting empty and why. That seems vital for efficiency.
It adds a layer of transparency, hopefully highlighting where bottlenecks might exist in the system.
Got it. Are there other ongoing feedback requirements?
Yes. There's also a requirement for an annual summary of feedback gathered directly from foster and adoptive parents, and from youth, too. This covers their experiences with things like the whole licensure process, the quality of the training they get, the level of support they feel they receive. It also asks for insights into why parents might decide to stop fostering, the reasons behind adoptions or guardianships that disrupt, and the challenges families say they face meeting the needs of the kids in their care.
Wow, that's digging deep into the real-world experience.
Yeah, it's trying to capture that lived experience to pinpoint systemic problems and figure out how to improve things continuously.
It really sounds like an effort to understand the whole foster care journey from everyone's perspective: kids, potential families, current caregivers. Now, what about that persistent issue, the really important one, of racial and ethnic disparities in this system?
The Act tackles that head on. There's a requirement for an annual report that specifically analyzes the state's challenges in recruiting, licensing, and effectively using families who reflect the racial and ethnic backgrounds of the children in care. And the report can't just identify the challenges, it also has to detail the specific steps the state is taking to try and overcome those barriers.
So a direct focus on equity and trying to ensure better cultural matches.
Exactly. It highlights a clear commitment to addressing those long-standing disparities.
That's a critical focus. Okay, so when does all this kick in? What's the timeline for these changes hitting the ground?
The general effective date is set for October 1st, 2026. However, there's a bit of wiggle room built in. If a state decides it needs to pass new state laws, not just budget stuff, but actual legislation to comply, they can get a bit more time.
How much more time?
The deadline then becomes the first day of the calendar quarter, right after their first regular legislative session ends, following the Act's passage. For states with 2-year sessions, each year counts as a separate session.
Okay, so some flexibility, depending on state legislative cycles. It recognizes things might take time to implement legally.
Right.
And finally, how does this act change the bigger national view of child welfare? Does it impact how we understand the system across the country?
It significantly strengthens the national picture, yes. The Act amends Section 479A of the Social Security Act. That's the part governing the annual Child Welfare Outcomes Report that goes to Congress. Starting with the report for fiscal year 2025, this big national report will have to include much more detailed information specifically about foster and adoptive families, state by state.
What kind of new information will be in that national report?
We'll start seeing consistent state-by-state data on the number, the demographics, the characteristics of foster and adoptive families, plus that crucial data point on potential families who aren't being utilized and the reasons why. The report will also have to summarize the key challenges and barriers that foster and adoptive parents are facing nationwide, things like recruitment hurdles, licensure difficulties, support issues, why people stop fostering, adoption disruptions, family struggles. This will be based on the state surveys we talked about.
And the diversity piece.
Yes. It will also summarize what states are reporting about their challenges in recruiting diverse families and the strategies they're using to address those barriers. So overall, it should give us a much clearer, more comprehensive national view of foster and adoptive family capacity and the systemic issues involved.
Okay, so bringing this all together, the Recruiting Families Using Data Act of 2025, it really feels like a potentially significant shift. The focus seems clear. Use data much more effectively, really push for collaboration between everyone involved, and place a much stronger emphasis on truly understanding and meeting the needs both of the children and of the families stepping up to care for them.
That's a great summary. It really does aim for a more data-informed and hopefully a more supportive and effective system overall.
It sounds like a move towards a system that's maybe more transparent and responsive.
That's the goal. And for listeners, perhaps those in that 22-45 age bracket thinking about family or community impact, this legislation could signal a move towards a process for foster care and adoption that's better supported, maybe more accessible. By focusing on data, feedback, and addressing challenges head-on, the hope is to make it more sustainable for those considering opening their hearts and homes.
It definitely makes you think, doesn't it? About the power of using data, using collaborative input to tackle really complex social challenges, like ensuring every child has a stable, loving home. You have to wonder what broader lessons are here. How could these principles, data-informed decisions, inclusive collaboration, apply elsewhere? In other parts of our communities, maybe even our own lives. It's definitely something worth mulling over.
Absolutely. Those underlying ideas, using information to truly understand the need and then working together inclusively to find solutions, they're powerful tools. They could be applied in so many different contexts beyond just this specific, very important issue.